Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We will now begin session S9-1 on the future of Korea Peninsula agriculture and development path of North Korean agriculture, 2020 Korea Global Forum for Peace. I'll be your moderator. My name is Chun Hyung-jin. Let me briefly go over the schedule of today's proceedings. This session is being hosted by the Korea Rural Economic Institute, and we'll hear the opening address from the president of our institute. And we will hear from Choi Yong-ho of KREI, then Director General Tuan Bui from the Institute of Economics in Vietnam. 2 presentations. Mr. Tuan Bui will be joining us virtually from Vietnam. Following that, we will hear from a panel discussion from 2:20 to 3 o'clock with about 4 panelists. And Mr. Kim Hong-sam will be moderating that session. And after that, we will have a group photo. This seminar has simultaneous interpretation services in Korean, English, and Vietnamese. So we will go in order. We will first of all hear from Kim Hong-sang, the president of the Korea Rural Economic Institute, for his opening remarks.
안녕하십니까?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the president of the Korea Rural Economic Institute. My name is Kim Hong-sang. This is a 2020 Korea Global Forum for Peace that is hosted by the Ministry of Unification. We are very pleased to host this S9-1 parallel track session. Because of COVID-19 global pandemic, we are faced with much difficulties. So I know that you must all be very busy. So thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. Our presentations, presenters, the discussants, and all of our participants joining us online, thank you very much for being with us. This CREI session was made possible thanks to the support of Minister Lee of Unification and his staff. The forum is being held under the theme of peace and prosperity in the Korean Peninsula, past, present, and the future. This year's Korea Global Forum for Peace will allow our institute to look into the past and present of Korean agriculture, and we will be sponsoring this session on the future of Korean Peninsula agriculture and development path of North Korean agriculture. There is currently an inter-Korean stalemate, and for us to imagine peace, there needs to be economic cooperation between the 2 Koreas as soon as possible. North Korea has seen a very low level of labor productivity and agricultural productivity, and this has led to chronic famine. That is why the cooperation in the agricultural sector for the 2 Koreas can be a catalyst to bring about more change forward. Many experts say that the DPRK economy is already at a level of some reform and openness. So there's some level of planned economy and market economy, and we're also seeing this playing out in the agricultural sector. Many transition economies, if we compare them to DPRK, we want to see what kind of growth path DPRK's agriculture is going to look like going forward. Agricultural cooperation between the 2 Koreas can lead to more further cooperation between ROK and DPRK. We need to bring in and usher in cooperation from the DPRK. We would like to see some more changes within the DPRK agricultural sector, and we have to exert efforts to look into the agricultural sector in the DPRK from a macro and micro point of view. CREI, the Korea Rural Economic Institute, wants to focus on that to try to understand the developments in North Korean agriculture and try to discuss the future orientation and the direction of North Korean agriculture going forward. We can learn more from the Vietnamese transition model, particularly with a focus on its agriculture. This can bring about lots of important implications for us to better understand DPRK agriculture, which is why we have asked a Vietnamese expert, Mr. Bui Quang Tuan, the Director General of the Institute of Economics at Vietnam, for his insight. The seminar will start shortly. We want to understand more about the growth path of DPRK agriculture, and we do hope to hear more insight from our panel. I would like to end by thanking once again the organizers at the Ministry of Unification for their hard work in organizing this session and this forum, and I'd like to thank all the staff here today. I know that we are living under the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope you stay healthy and strong. Thank you.
예, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. Now, as was announced earlier, we're going to begin our theme presentations. Our first presentation will be delivered by Dr. Yong-ho Choi, a research fellow at Korea Rural Economic Institute, who will be speaking about development pathway and policy tasks for the North Korean agriculture. Hello, as was introduced, I'm from Korea. I am Choi Yong-ho. I'm very pleased to be here for the Korea Global Forum for Peace. It's a great honor, and I will begin my presentation. The topic of my presentation is development pathway and policy tasks for the North Korean agriculture. I will first start with the background and the purpose of this discussion, and I will talk about the future pathway for the development of the North Korean agriculture. And the third area that I want to focus on is the current reality of the North Korean agriculture and the level of agricultural administration. Fourth is to ensure development of the agriculture in North Korea. What are the policy tasks for both South and North Korea? Agriculture is important not only for North Korea, but also for Korea, China, Japan, the United States. It is a critical element to ensuring political, economic, and social stability. But recently, the North Korean agriculture has been experiencing some difficulties equivalent to a crisis, and we're seeing those symptoms of rising starting from last year. February 2019, the Kim Sung-hee, a permanent ambassador to the UN, made an appeal to the International Organization for Food Aid. And also in April last year, there was a document released by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the DPRK, which dealt with the emergency measure needed for food import for the country. And also Rodong Shinmun, which is a newspaper, there were a lot of articles that focus on the importance of producing agriculture products. So FAO and WFP had a joint mission in May of last year, and they had a result published, that there is a lack of about 1.3 million tons of food for North Korean people. And the situation has actually gotten worse in 2020 because there's a sanctions regime by the international community. And also starting from February, the country has come under the influence of COVID-19. And also there has been a lot of rain, monsoon, as well as storms, leading to flooding-related damages, especially in those warehouses that are keeping the crops and grains. That maybe the country may be able to manage to survive this year, but the food situation next year is only going to get worse starting from next year. So there are a lot of problems at hand for the North Korean economy. So we need to find a way as to how North Korea can survive that crisis and how they can improve their agriculture productivity. So the purpose of this discussion is that to ensure fundamental development of the North Korean agriculture, we need to understand what policy options and tasks that exist for Korea and North Korea. Let's take a look at those transition countries with formalist socialist regimes and how were they able to develop their agriculture? What are some of the policies undertaken by these economies, and what was the effect or the impact from these policies from the economic point of view? And World Bank and other international organizations. Well, especially World Bank has an objective evaluation criteria for looking at the agricultural administration of each country and the current status of their agriculture development. There are benchmarks and the criteria that have been put in place, and we will try to utilize those criteria to understand where North Korea is in terms of agriculture development. What is really important is that there's reform and market opening required for the DPRK to introduce the market economic system. This is very critical for the development of agriculture. That would be the assumption of this talk. And we're going to be taking a very macro, high-level, and long-term view for this topic. So what is the pathway that North Korea has been taking in terms of agriculture development? There will be words related to economics. So there are some technical terms used. Now you have economic entities, which are producers, consumers. And because it is a planned economy, you have Kim Jong-un, leader and the chairman. And there are goods. For example, you have rice and apple and rice and pork. So consumers and the government, in the process of consumption, they get a level of satisfaction. Consumers would have a different level of expectation and satisfaction as versus that of the government. So they show different curves in terms of preference for consumption. And here is the production possibility curve. And you will see this concave structure. The one that is on the curve line shows the maximum production output that North Korea can expect if it is at its most productive state. So if North Korea is very efficient in agriculture production, that's the maximum that it can reach. But the reality is actually far from that. And the other line shows a current state of North Korea because of a lot of inefficiencies. There's really not effective production of agriculture. And based on this understanding, I conducted an analysis to understand what impact that we would see on the pathway of development for the North Korean agriculture. First of all, when market liberalization, for example, and market opening and reform policies were to be introduced by North Korea, the North Korean government decided to reduce its subsidies for cooperative farms and so forth, to decentralize autonomy. And if those, for example, measures are taken, then competition will be introduced, and which will lead to massive changes in the environment. But however, it will weaken the control by the state, and the market economy will become strengthened. So in terms of producing inputs for the agriculture development as well as processing and distribution, the former relations would be disrupted, and a new relations would have to be developed, which would have a negative impact on consumer welfare. Now, the former socialist countries, as they were going through transition, they all went through this initial growing pains. And do we really have this problem for a long time, a longer extended period of time, or a short time? Maybe that there was a bit of a difference in terms of the duration, but anyway, new type of relation is to be formed after a certain period of time, and then they will go back to where they were. Now, what is important is the pace of introduction of the market economic system. Is it done on a gradual basis, for example, by minimizing side effects, or is it done on a very radical basis? And you would see a lot of differences in terms of economic performance and results. And also to minimize side effects, it was very important for these transition economies to bring in international support. Second is the efficiency of production system. This socialist agriculture system has a lot of embedded inefficiencies, and if they're removed, inputs would be distributed by the market function, and cooperative farms, these inefficient cooperative farms would have to exit the market. Then the curve would move towards dot A, which is the maximum production volume potential, with higher consumer welfare. Third is the allocational efficiency. I'm not sure whether the term is relevant here. This is where the government has less subsidy for production and consumption. The products would be developed in line with the preference of consumers. For example, rice would be substituted by apples, and the production volume would be adjusted in accordance with the demands and supply of the market. So it will be left up to the market to decide how much to produce and what to produce. That would lead to enhanced efficiency of allocation. Then here, critical factor is pricing. And how much autonomy would you be able to have in terms of managing and cultivating your crops? And fourth is the effect of free trade. Now, North Korea has competitive advantages in some of the areas, for example, crops, where they don't have to put in a lot of inputs, but they would still be able to get a lot of outputs out of it. And for those high cost items, it would be better and efficient for North Korea to import those products rather than trying to domestically produce it. So once you have this free trade system, then your crops and your grains would be determined by the prices that are set outside the country. Last factor that is important to consider is the effect of advancement of agricultural technology. Once advanced farming technologies are introduced into the country, along with management techniques or skills, now production capability, production possibility curve could be widened. And we would be able to have these 5 different effects as we have witnessed with previous transition economies. So all in all, what are the possible benefits that we can draw out of these different pathways? First is price liberalization. Second, trade liberalization. A third is farmland privatization, cooperative reform, agriculture finance, and privatization of agriculture forward and backward industries. And the last one is realignment of systems and infrastructures. So they would represent the effect of the 5 policies that I've mentioned before, and it would also have a positive impact in terms of social welfare. So these policies and indicators, they don't actually match one-on-one, not on an apple-to-apple comparison, because one indicator could be possibly affected by various policies, and one policy could have multiple effects. So we need to keep that in mind. So other than these policy effects, there could be the demographic changes or climate change and other external factors that would have a bearing on the indicators. So it's very important to have these policies in place. We need to understand the reality, what's the current level of the agricultural administration of North Korea. As you understand, there are not many statistics available. So we need to refer to this status data on the supply and demand of North Korea food from 2012 to 2018. The production volume, the country was able to produce about 4.8 million tons at a maximum. The total supply comprises assistance and aid from overseas and also import by the country. Then you would have a total supply of food. As for international aid, the data is not very much available, so I only included the data for the import volume. And for the total consumption, that's the amount of calories that would be needed for the total population. The total calories needed would be about 5.5 million, but production volume was only about 4.8 million, which would mean that there's a gap of about 700,000. And North Korea would be importing these goods in a varying volume, and international assistance would also vary by year. So it would be very difficult to fully understand where North Korea is in terms of food production. As I mentioned before, North Korea would look to other countries for food assistance. And because that is what's happening in North Korea starting last year, it seems that situation is getting worse. Maybe North Korea might be able to manage the situation, but with COVID-19, with the production disruption, and because there was a lot of flooding in the cultivated fertile lands, North Korea had much impact. So it might be able to manage this year, but it might really have difficulties starting next year. It might go in for a worse situation. And due to COVID-19, in February, the country decided to close down its borders, and there was a rapid increase in terms of market prices for food. But it was able to level off the prices, and market prices are now remaining at a stable level. So we don't really think that there will be any critical food crisis for this year. So considering these factors, what were some of the main drivers that affected the current North Korean food situation? It is that the fertile land, the agricultural land, is quite limited. The country is very mountainous. So there's not many lands available suitable for cultivation in the first place. since that when you do rice planting, for example, people have to line up to plant the rice because there's not much machinery available. It's not automated. And third is fertilizer, tractors, high quality seeds, raw materials, fuels. All these input materials are deficient, which would hamper the productivity of agriculture. And other natural disasters, for example, drought, flood, storms, which is very much undermining the basis for agriculture production. It is not restored, and even if the country wants to restore it, it really takes a long time. And that could serve as an issue here. Last but not least is that with the Kim Jong-un administration in place, the country wanted to pursue a lot of reforms, but still there's a lack of incentives, perhaps due to the structural problems or because of the changes in policies. There's a lack of trust in the policies. Because of these definitive limitations, the country is unable to improve its productivity. There are two things that we want to take note of in terms of policies. In 2012, June of 23rd, a new economic management system policy was announced by Kim Jong-un as he came into power. So he made an announcement for the new economic management system. For the agriculture sector here, well, here number 1 and 2 and 3, they're related to planned economy, how they want to improve the planned centrally planned economic system. And for example, reducing the scale of cooperative farms, that the country was trying to bring in some market economy here, but one cannot really say that this is a very reformist-driven agenda. And the second is, in 2014, a statement was made by Kim Jong-un on the 30th of May. This can be seen as a more radical approach. It is giving land back to the citizens so they can be put under their responsible management. So about 1,000 pyong of land would be given to maybe 3 or 4 farmers to manage them autonomously. And also the share of agriculture produce would be split in a more improved manner between the state and the farmers, 7-3. Could you maybe pace up? So yes, let's take a look at the current level of agriculture administration. I talked about various policy factors. Now, the World Bank had a criteria for evaluating transition economies. And if we use that here for North Korea, there are 5 major indicators which are used to evaluate the North Korean situation. Back in 1991, 1992, these transition economies began pursuing their transition. So it would be important to understand where they would be after 5 or 6 years. On a scale of 1 to 10, on average, North Korea would be in around 5 to 6, 4 in the range of 4 to 7. A lot of indicators would be found there in the middle. So these transition countries would be in that range. And if we apply that to North Korea now, state has a control on trade, export, as well as pricing. So the score would not be necessarily be high here. But the market economic elements are very much expanding. So we gave 2 points. In terms of reform for cooperative farms and privatization of farmland, private ownership is not recognized by the state, but still through market economy, we see some parts of privatization taking place, and also autonomous management is introduced for some cooperative farms. Although it is not really widespread across the country, we still see some pockets of that. And next one is realignment of the agriculture finance. They have a central banking system, and they have commercial banks over here, and the local banks were fully closed down. So it's about 5 to 6 because they have commercial banks available. The 4th indicator is related to privatization of forward and backward industries. Now, many companies are now privatized. A lot of capital investment is made, so the country is in about 5 to 6 range. The last one is very important. This is related to the structure and systems. However, there haven't been much changes in North Korea in terms of agriculture public sector, so the country had a very low score for the last indicator. And based on this analysis, to facilitate development of the North Korean agriculture, what should we do in terms of policies? North Korea used to have a traditional socialist agriculture line. It is now slowly transitioning towards market economy. And those key policy options that I mentioned must be pursued by North Korea. However, due to situations at home and abroad, I don't think the country is in the right position to pursue that. And when these policies are implemented, they would have to be implemented in a harmonious way. And also, side effects would have to be considered, and the pace of reform would have to be managed very well. And what are the hallmarks for South Korea then? This would be my last slide. Now, North Korea is taking the initiative for policy change. Even so, it would have to solicit investment from outside. Otherwise, it will not be able to sustain its agricultural development. If the economy itself goes through reform, whether it is tourism or natural resources, they would be able to invite a lot of investment. So we're not exactly sure whether agriculture sector would be able to entice that investment. So it's very important to bring investment into the agriculture sector. Now, they're undergoing food crisis, agriculture crisis. We expect a lot of initial problems to occur. So proper level of assistance and agriculture cooperation would be required from South Korea. And I will talk about specific measures for doing so, maybe on a separate occasion. Now, once North Korea embarks on its journey towards market economy, it would have to cooperate further with South Korea. So how would we do that in terms of development cooperation of public sector and private sector? I think all these sectors would have to have harmony. And we also need to remember that there's that conflict issue even amongst themselves. And we have to make sure that our farmers are not left behind in this process, because we have cooperation projects with North Korea and direct bilateral projects. We also need to manage expectations of other stakeholders as well. Thank you very much. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Che.
주제 발표.
So we'll now move on to our second presentation. We will be listening to Mr. Tuan Bui, who is a Director General at the Institute of Economics of Vietnam. He's going to tell us about agricultural reforms in Vietnam and in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and some implications. He's joining us from Vietnam.
Thưa các quý vị đại biểu,
Distinguished guests, it is an honor for me to give this presentation at this forum. Because of COVID-19, I wasn't able to fly to South Korea in person, and I have no choice but to join you just virtually. And this is quite unfortunate for me personally. But I will do my best to tell you more about the current status here in Vietnam and the research that I've done on the DPRK. I believe that you already have copies of my presentation materials with you. Today, I will be telling you about the agricultural reforms in Vietnam and what exactly is happening in terms of agricultural reforms at the DPRK. Please refer to the screen in front of you. Can you please go to the next slide for me?
Alo. Alo. Vâng vâng. Ờ, tôi sẽ tập trung nhiều vào cái
I'm sorry, I was just trying to see whether you can hear me or not. I'm sure you can hear me. Oh, I will begin by telling you about the agricultural reforms in Vietnam, the results, and the agricultural reform in North Korea. I will end my presentation by talking about some implications. However, I've listened to what Dr. Choi's presentation, and I don't think that there are many differences between his research and my research, but I would just like to provide the Vietnamese point of view to how we see DPRK. We had independence in 1975. The current status in Vietnam at the time and the current situation in DPRK is not that different. In fact, I can say that the two countries were very similar in some sectors. In Vietnam, we've worked very hard for a long time on economic reforms. And in 1986, through a door opening, or the openness and reform, a Doi Moi initiative, we were able to transition in terms of our economic structure. And I know that you will join me in saying that Vietnam has seen remarkable progress since then. I think that the DPRK wants to take some lessons from the Vietnamese experience. If you can find some applications for the DPRK, one of them would be the Doi Moi initiative, the Doi Moi reforms. That could be a possible case that can be applied to DPRK. This the Doi Moi reforms were first proclaimed in the 1980s, and it was really what announced Vietnam's transition to the market economy. It's an overall comprehensive market reform. And due to this economic policy, Vietnam was able to eradicate much of its poverty, for instance, and it was able to lead to some level of economic growth, very accelerated economic growth. This year, our economic growth, the growth rate, has dipped slightly, but up until last year, our economic growth was quite remarkable, about 6.8% to 7% annually. And in 1986, before the Doi Moi reforms and after the Doi Moi reforms, if I can just compare the time before that, the poverty rate was over 70% before the Doi Moi reforms. This level of poverty would make it very difficult for much of the population in Vietnam to make a living and just live their daily life. The poverty rate was over 70% before the Doi Moi reforms, but as of 2020, today, the poverty rate is below 7%. What was below 70% has gone down, way down to below 7%, as you can see with the statistics. So I would like to refer you to the slide. So in the case of Vietnam, the agricultural sector before the reforms is where I would like to direct your attention. These reforms all took place before 1986. Before these reforms, Vietnam had a very heavily centrally planned, centralized economy. And its agricultural labor market participation was over 70%. which is rather different from where Vietnam stands today. After Vietnam's unification in 1975, there were some challenges. Of course, following wars in any country would be met with many difficulties. But in 1978 and 1979, there were heavy floods in the Mekong Delta region. And when I say the Mekong Delta region, this is a region that is responsible for major rice production. However, as I mentioned, in 1978 and 79, there were heavy floods that hit this region. And this means that actual rice production decreased sharply. And after 1977, there was a cutoff on the aid that was supplied by China up until then. As you know, before then, Vietnam was a socialist republic, and there was some Chinese aid before the 1970s or so. But since 1977, China effectively stopped all aid to Vietnam because of the social developments and international developments, and also of the climate developments in 1976 and 1979. Between those years, our food production, and especially rice production, decreased sharply. For example, rice production grew down from 1.13 million to about 613,000 tons. And to overcome this food shortage in 1981, Vietnamese government came up with what we call the Directive 100. This was promulgated by the Vietnamese government. The directive composed of 100 different measures, including labor productivity, research and management to enhance labor productivity, and providing feedback to the efforts made for labor productivity to continue to try to enhance the agricultural sector as well. These were some of the measures that were included in the Directive 100. However, at the time, Vietnam still had a group economic or community economic management system. By that I mean there were many cooperatives and collectives in Vietnam at the time, and these different collectives were in operation in the market. These collectives would primarily be composed of family units, and the family units would discuss ways to try to enhance their labor productivity. And this also included agricultural labor productivity as well. However, what I want to say is that this Directive 100 did not lay open the issue of ownership and agriculture sector. That is to say, ownership was not liberalized due to Directive 100. The Directive 100 were still a set of policy measures that were conducted within a community or collective management system. So because of that, it was not able to provide substantial accomplishments at a level that we would have wanted. And as you know, in the agricultural sector, the commitment of the farmers, that is to say, the workers or laborers, which primarily are farmers, their willpower is very important. They have to be given freedom and free rein to enhance the agricultural productivity. But in the case of Vietnam, early on, there weren't measures that were provided to allow for autonomy and independence for the farmers. If they were given more of a free rein, then the farmers would have taken more initiative. But they were not. The Directive 100 still provided for a centrally planned, centralized economy, and it just provided for some small room for maneuver with collectives and cooperatives. So in the agricultural sector, as I mentioned before, the actual economic reforms took place after 1986, and this is something that I am pretty confident about. Beginning in 1986, we adopted the free market economy. And so even in the agricultural sector, we provided some level of initiative and autonomy to Vietnamese farmers. So for example, in the early reforms and the later reforms, I think it would be beneficial if we could compare those two. In the early reforms, they were mostly about improving the collective effort. They were mostly designed to make collectives more efficient. However, the later reforms were designed to try to provide more incentives to farmers so that they can take more of an initiative. So the production unit was set aside for each family, so each farming household, and they were given the authority to use land. The land use rights was very important here for Vietnam. This was a massive reform because, as you understand, we were based on a socialist economy, and so all the land was really effectively owned by the state. But in 1988, Resolution 10 was passed by the state, 10 different resolutions, and within this resolution, it talks about land use rights. The main unit of agricultural production would be formalized as farm households, and land use rights would be allocated to these farming households. And this is made official in the resolution. I am actually skipping over on some of the slides. I'm not going in exact order, but if you had the opportunity to look at this before, I think that you would have a good understanding of what we did in Vietnam before and after the reforms.
Thêm vào đó, năm 1989, thì nhà nước tiến hành cải cách về giá đối với các sản phẩm nông nghiệp.
I just want to briefly talk about what happened in 1989. There were some widespread reforms in Vietnam as well. In 1989, before them, the states would buy and sell food and provide them to the people, but this system was abolished. So before 1989, this food purchasing system by the state was in place, but after 1989, this food purchase and sales system was abolished, and there was a complete overhaul in the provision price system, which meant that there was a liberalization of food prices, and many trade projects in the agricultural sector were also established and liberalized. In 1989, the Vietnamese government for the first time allowed enterprises of all the economic sectors to directly export their own products and import raw materials for their own production. And this also includes the agricultural sector. This means to say that the farmers, the different agricultural products that they harvested, they could, of their own initiative, sell these at market prices. The farmers and the people of Vietnam, they could adjust the prices and they could determine the prices. So this is a completely market price-based economy, as you can see. And this really was revolutionary for Vietnam at the time, because in agriculture, this trade liberalization was really being established. In the past, the state would make some central planning, and the prices would be determined by the state. However, under this new system, prices could be set by the market. This would be applied not just to agricultural products, but to other consumer goods as well. And this led to a price liberalization across the board. This meant that farmers can buy what they needed and sell what they needed. They could purchase seeds, they could purchase fertilizer if they needed them. there was complete price liberalization and trade liberalization, which would always go together in tandem. Farmers take up the vast majority of the population of Vietnam. The fact that these farmers were able to set their own prices, this price setting autonomy, was something that really allowed this market liberalization to take place all across Vietnam. In 1993, the first land law was passed in Vietnam. The land law was a very big event for Vietnam. According to our laws, they state that all land ownership rests with the Vietnamese regime. However, in this land law, it says that land belongs to the entire people, although it is managed by the state. That is to say, land belongs to the state. The land is managed by the state, but that the ownership actually belongs to the people. The state allocates land to organizations, households, and individuals, including farmers, for stable and long-term use. This is a surprising change, and in this code, land use rights for each farming household have been more expanded than before. In the past, land was just used for cultivation and to build houses on, but now land use rights, because people had that, they could convert, transfer, lease, inherit, and to mortgage these land use rights. This means that land has this market value, and it's no longer owned by the state. The land here is owned by people, and the people get to use the land as well. Vietnam has promulgated many enforcement decrees to give more shape and flesh out the land law. If you take a look at this slide, you would see some results after the agricultural reforms that were rolled out in Vietnam. See agricultural services and livestock and crops. The slide is from 1990 to 1996. This slide is from 1997 to 2005. There was dramatic growth during this time frame because we saw a lot of agricultural growth. And from 2005 to 2015 as well. As you can see on this bar chart, you would see that there is much development in the agricultural sector, especially compared to other sectors in our economy. You would see crop, livestock, agricultural services, afforestation, forestry services, fisheries, and agriculture. Now I would like to pivot to the DPRK. I listened well to Dr. Choi Yong-ho's presentation. And I have to say, I learned a lot from the presentation. DPRK has also begun agricultural reforms. I think that my presentation overlaps with what Dr. Choi said. North Korea has limited resources for agricultural growth, and there was also some mention of the terrain. Only about 18% of the total land mass is arable. And in the case of the DPRK, in 1995 and 1996, the country was also met with heavy floods. In 1997, there was a severe drought, which led to huge famines. And there were also some allies, in the case of the DPRK, which provided economic aid to the DPRK, but there was a decrease in economic assistance. Vietnam also experienced a cut in aid, for example, from China and from the Soviet Union after unification of Vietnam. And this was something that the DPRK could not fight against. Vietnam also faced something very similar. We had no choice but to stand on our own 2 feet. Based on this, I would just like to briefly tell you some implications. Vietnam really worked very hard to stand on our own feet and become more self-reliant. In the process, there was some support from other countries. In the 1980s, in the case of Vietnam, I think that Vietnam in the 1980s is very similar to today's DPRK. So where DPRK stands right now is very similar to where Vietnam was in the early 1980s. DPRK has to change. I know that the other speaker has already said before me the field responsibility system, which was begun by DPRK, and that is true. Beginning in 2012, the FRS was minimized down to individual field responsibility system. I think this is very similar to what the speaker already said in terms of the field responsibility system, or the FRS, but DPRK also adopted that, and right now the DPRK is also reducing government set quotas and allowing more initiative to the farmers themselves. They are encouraging the farmers to engage in more autonomy. This FRS, the Field Responsibility System, I would like to refer to that as FRS. As I understand, it is a very widespread practice now among farmers and the DPRK. We will have to continue to take note of the developments in the DPRK and to make sure that North Korea will develop further going forward. It will be necessary to share much sufficient information and to resolve the different challenges the DPRK has. However, for us to resolve those challenges, the researchers and the scholars who are studying DPRK, those efforts would have to be brought together, and in particular, those people who experience living in transition, who came from the transition economies, such as Vietnam, that experience should also come together so that we can contribute to further development in DPRK, and that we could have that desirable level of cooperation going forward. And I do hope that we can identify such measures of cooperation. Even now, Vietnam is working tirelessly for economic change. We have to understand what exactly we need right now, especially within a socialist economy. We have to see what lessons learned from Vietnam can be applied to the DPRK. And conversely, Vietnam will also engage in more research to try to undertake economic change. Currently, many foreign companies have made inroads into the Vietnamese markets, and I'm sure you know very well, but however, this year's FDI, foreign direct investment, fell very sharply, but up until last year, FDI was really instrumental in leading the growth in Vietnam. And this is something that the DPRK should learn from to open its doors to foreign investment. We really have to work together to try to urge DPRK to open its doors to foreign capital. And this is something that we will have to take a more macroeconomic approach on. And obviously, this is not something that would be done in the short term. This is a research that merits a long-term outlook. The most important thing is to encourage North Korea to open its doors and to allow them to upgrade their agricultural sector, which is the key to their production. And again, going back to agriculture, the autonomy and responsibility of the farming practices, of the farming results, should be given solely to the farmers so that they can feel more self-reliant. And when it comes to profits and losses, the farmers should be made to recognize them both so that they can be more committed to more enhanced productivity. I think there is a difference between Vietnam and DPRK, where there are still some of these cooperatives slash collectives in Vietnam. We do what we call co-production and co-distribution. And as I mentioned before, there is the FRS, or Field Responsibility System, in the DPRK, but they still rely more heavily on collectives. So I think that they would have to engage in more aggressive reforms. They can still have the collectives, but they can also offer more incentives to individual farming households. And that is my own personal opinion. We are living in a COVID-19 era, and there were heavy rains very recently as well. So I think that Chairman Kim would have a lot of concerns. However, what is most important is they shouldn't just try to maintain the status quo, that they should try to do their best to enhance the commitment of the farmers, that this commitment of the farmers can also become more widespread to other laborers. There needs to be a very drastic change within DPRK. This is my opinion. I am offering these different proposals because unless there is a change in the system, if the same system is in place, and you only issue minor changes, then you will not be able to see a massive effect. As I mentioned before, we had that Directive 100 in Vietnam, but it wasn't very successful. The Doi Moi reforms, especially the 10 measures, were even more enabling because these 10 measures actually change the system. So for the DPRK as well, even if it might be very difficult for them, they would have to change their system to change its economy and change its market.
예, 베트남의 생생한 농업 개혁 사례와
Yes, thank you very much for telling us a little bit about the situation in Vietnam and DPRK. Thank you very much to Vui Quang Tuan, Director General at the Institute of Economics in Vietnam.
를 모두
So we have completed two presentations. We're going to again invite President Kim Hong-sang from Cree to begin the discussion. Dr. Che touched upon market opening reform of the North Korean economy, shared his views on what North Korea should do and its implications to the agricultural sector. Based on that, he shared his view on the development path that North Korea and agriculture should take, as well as policy tasks. Looking at the current state of the North Korean agriculture, as was mentioned by Dr. Bui, market economy is here to stay in North Korea. However, there are various policy tasks that need to be undertaken by North Korea. And I think both of the directors call for the need or call for the change in the system institutions and inducing investment, capital from outside. It's not just financial capital, there has to be market, economic institution systems, as well as the skills. So in that regards, inter-Korean cooperation really requires a long-term horizon, mid to long-term effort. At the same time, it has to be done in cooperation with the community of nations and also with neighboring economies. So there has to be an adjustment of our views and interests in relation to the market economy. And Director General Bui Quang Tuan talked about the reforms in Vietnam, how it brought about changes in terms of institutional framework, but also in terms of the system and also the behavioral change of the farmers themselves. He shared some specific experiences of the farmers, and also he compared that to various difficulties that North Korea is undergoing right now. He said that a long-term horizon is really needed. And really to understand what is going on amongst the residents in North Korea. And system transition would be needed to bring about that practical change on the part of the North Korean residents. So with that, we're going to begin our discussion. We have 4 panelists for this session. Let me introduce to you each of our panelists. We have right next to Choi Yong-ho, we have Dr. Kim Young-hoon from KRI, Senior Research Fellow. He joined the Institute in 1987. He is the authority on North Korean agriculture. He's also working as a member of the Special Advisory Committee under the President. For the fisheries part, he's a chairperson of the committee under the President office, and I believe that he would be able to share with us his insights based on his experience in the research. Next to me, we have Dr. Yang Moon-soo, who's a professor vice president at the University of Northern Studies. He got his degree in Japan. He also worked as a journalist at Mail Economic Daily, also served as a vice director of various research institutes. So he has a lot to share, especially in terms of experience as well as academic knowledge. I really look forward to his discussion. And after our second discussion, we will be hearing from Dr. Choi Jang-ho from KGFP, Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. He will talk about North Korea and its relations with the world. KGFP conducts an analysis on our economic policies for the government, and he's responsible for the research on North Korean studies. So he'll be able to address the issue from a very macro point of view. And last but not least, we have discussed Mr. Im Hyung-jun, who is the director of the World Food Program Global Office in Korea. 2 years ago, while we were working on U.S. SDG, especially for the food production, I had a chance to work with him. He has a lot of understanding about global standards, and at the same time, he has a lot of local experience from the Korean market as well, especially as it relates to international cooperation programs. He will be sharing his global insights and also domestic and local strategic recommendations and inputs. As for the discussion, we will go in the order that was just shared with you. So Dr. Bui Quang Tuan, his presentation, it was very practical. It really gave us a lot of implications. So I didn't really give him any time constraint or limit for the presentation. So looking at the time, we have 55 minutes left. And we will need to also get some responses from the speakers. I would like to ask our discussants to limit their talk within 5-minute time frame. So Dr. Kim, would you like to begin first? Thank you very much, President. Before I begin my discussion, as I was listening to Dr. Choi's presentation, I have a couple of questions for Dr. Choi, and I would like to ask Dr. Chet to respond to those questions later on. So there is a lot of benefits to be gained from the introduction of the market economy, and you gave us a theoretical model, and then you apply that to the current agriculture status of North Korea. So it is trying to reform its economy through introducing market economy. It also reformed agricultural sectors such as cooperative system and production system. So regarding the theoretical model, there are various benefits that you cited. I want to understand whether there were any actual deliverables that were generated from this policy change. I want to understand whether there were any practical benefits. So, listening to our two presenters gave me a lot of food for thought when it comes to North Korea as well as Vietnam. Now they are implementing market economy, and they continue to reform their agriculture sector, and it led to some massive changes, whether they're good or bad. In Vietnam, they had a production increase, and in the PRK, they had a growth in terms of production volume. But we're not exactly sure whether that is directly translated as a benefit of agriculture reform. There's some ambiguities there. That's where I want to really focus on. Very interesting. Although the two countries have similarities, but in terms of outcome, there were some differences. So what exactly are they? That is the answer that I wanted to answer while I was listening to you. And in my view, DPRK had a lot of agriculture reform. 1990s, they had an economic crisis back then, and I think DPRK decided to pursue reform in the agriculture sector. 1996, the new circle system, Punjo system, and in 2000, then they had a reform measure taken in July as well. So they took a step further to reform the sector. And in 2012, right after Kim Jong-un came into power, 2012, the Uri식 economic management system. It's a North Korean style of economic reform. So these the agricultural reforms have been around in DPRK for a very long time. And it seems to have evolved over the years. Nevertheless, in terms of production, we're not exactly sure whether there is any positive effect that has come from such reforms. In the early 2000s and mid-2000s, we had some production increase. But in the 80s and 90s, the country was not able to go back to what it used to produce 20 years ago. Now, the country is now classified as a shortage country, and it is now getting much. Well, it is actually drawing a lot of concerns from outside world that it is now undergoing food crisis. So they had an agriculture reform. They attempted these experiments, but have they really translated into positive benefits for the productivity increase? For North Korea, I have a big question mark for that. So there has to be capital funding resource or financing that would sustain the reform. And I think North Korea failed at that because there's no internal capital coming from within. It would have to look to the international community for funding. But North Korea is isolated at best, and the international community has no intention whatsoever to give that money to North Korea. So funding and reform would have to go together like two wheels of a car, but that was never the case. That is why the reform in North Korea was a failure. That was my provisional conclusion. But looking at Vietnam, I think perhaps we can take a different approach. Dr. Bui Quang Tuan, your presentation was very wonderful. Vietnam, I think starting from 1981, I think it began the reform that they would have a contract production for the farms and the farmers in 88. The Resolution 10, then they would have the FRS system, and in 1993, the land reform was implemented. The reform was in the final stage. And starting from the 90s, so up until the 80s, Vietnam really didn't have a fully open economy because it was at war, and it had the economic solidarity with socialist countries, but it was broken in the 1990s. So it was in a very difficult situation on the international arena. So it was not able to finance capital from overseas. And only in the 1990s, it then began to promote exchanges with other countries, and they had the diplomatic ties established with the other Western countries afterwards. So in the 80s, they didn't have any capital. They only had a reform. But in the 90s, they had the reform plus capital from overseas, funding. So what happened to agriculture production in the 80s and 90s? They showed remarkable growth in the 80s for agriculture. 65% crop production was witnessed, 65% growth. And some later years, they had a 67.5% growth in production for agriculture. So they had a reform back in the 80s, and they didn't back it up with capital, but still it grew by 65%. So even equivalent to the era when the country was able to get capital from overseas. So what was it? What was it different from North Korea? So North Korea didn't have capital from overseas, and it was not able to succeed with its reform. We could say that, but that was not necessarily the case for Vietnam. So there's a big difference between the two countries. For North Korea, in terms of funding, isolation, or hostile confrontations with other countries, that actually overshadowed any meaningful efforts in terms of reform, not like Vietnam. Vietnam didn't have any external enemy. It was not coming under threat. It was not left in complete isolation. So internal reform had a very strong impetus, was able to bring a lot of benefits. But North Korea was not in that situation at all. Because of these factors, you had this failure or success in the reform. And I would like to get your views on that. So my conclusion is the agriculture or economic situation of North Korea, these problems actually have to come. They come from the state of confrontation, and North Korea would have to remove itself out of that isolation if it really wants to pursue meaningful reforms. Thank you. And other points I want to address in a later time. Thank you very much. Dr. Kim, you have conducted your research on North Korea for quite a long time, and you've made comments regarding the Vietnamese presentation. In the 1980s and 90s, Vietnam went through massive changes, and you drew comparison in agriculture reform between the two countries. Although there are similarities, there were some differences. And really, we need to revisit this issue. Thank you, Dr. Yang.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this very meaningful forum. I listened to Dr. Choi and Dr. Vui's presentations on the agricultural sector and the DPRK, and it gave me much lessons. I've been doing some research in the DPRK economy, and I wanted to try to take a more in-depth look into the North Korean agriculture. And this has led to some concerns. I would like to share with you my impressions on Dr. Choi's presentation and Dr. Bui's presentation as well. I would like to begin. I do have some questions that I would like to ask Dr. Bui, because I do have some questions that I would like to ask him about the Vietnamese situation. I think Dr. Kim already mentioned in his comments, but DPRK has for a long time tried to implement some agricultural reform policies because their famine situation was such a big challenge for them. And so it compared itself against other countries, especially for those areas where they could not make enough of a performance, and how they should evaluate themselves in terms of their reform. Dr. Choi said that the frame that he has been able to provide in his presentation is very interesting. We talk about liberalization, privatization, reform, and banking sector reform, but you came up with these 5 indicators for the agricultural sector in particular to evaluate a DPRK economy. That really provided me with a lot of information, but I think if we can narrow it down a little bit more, the 2 indicators, the top 2 indicators, I think they are more specific and more key to understanding DPRK agricultural sector. And so I would like to focus my comments on those two indicators. The first is trade liberalization and the agricultural markets and the land reforms and cooperatives and structural reform as well. These are the similar frameworks that we use when we study the DPRK economy. Let's say China, Vietnam, they do agricultural reform. And some of the phenomena that we were able to identify earlier on are these two indicators that I just mentioned. Dr. Choi's second frame, or the World Bank indicator that he mentioned, is where the reforms start branching out into ownership because you start out with collective farming. Maybe the collective farms should be dismantled and it should be reverted to the unit of households. That household farming should be more developed. And then, or it's either that or you can go in reverse order. And maybe you can do a trade liberalization. That is to say, allow the agricultural products to be sold at market price in the markets, and then later, maybe due to inflation, the prices will go up. In a traditional socialist economy, the agricultural prices were set and predetermined, and they were typically lower than industrial goods or consumer goods. This meant that farmers were always at an unfavorable condition compared to industrial workers or workers of other sectors. This meant that the farmers were struggling against a structure that was not really conducive for them. And therefore, they wanted to change around this structure by providing more stronger incentives to the farmers and provide the right conditions to allow the farmers to engage in more initiatives in terms of their farming. The DPRK, I think, is doing something very similar in that regard, but there is the change, the difference in scope. So, for example, the DPRK is not able to fully dismantle the collective farms. However, they are trying to scale down these collective farms. So they're not exactly household farms, but there are maybe some cousins and wider families coming together to farm in one household. And secondly, they can increase the prices of the agricultural goods. But in the case of the DPRK, the market itself began in the unofficial sector and then moved on to the official sector. So when we think about these non-grain prices, that's where the price increase started with. The non-grain prices began, and then later on, the price increase moved on to grains, including rice as well. But under Kim Jong-un's leadership, he tried to come up with many different systems. So, for example, the state's purchasing system and a distribution system to try to provide more incentives to the farmers. So it appears that Kim Jong-un has been trying to make more efforts into this sphere. We were very eager to see what kind of outcome they would have, but unfortunately maybe there is some enhancement in productivity, but overall the productivity increases were not sufficient. And we wanted to see why that is the case. When the DPRK adopted this new institution, and changing this purchasing system or purchasing this distribution system, the promises were not necessarily kept by the state. When the state made enough purchases, the rest, the surplus, should be given to the farmers so that they could sell at the market. But this promise was not kept by the farmers. The promise was not kept by the state? Why didn't they keep the promise? I don't know if they refused to keep it or they just did not because they didn't want to. But in any case, for the DPRK, they are maintaining this purchasing system. And perhaps it is the case that the state was not able to secure enough of a quantity that they wanted to purchase. And they could not release the surplus to the farmers because there was no surplus to release. That meant that the DPRK state was not able to fulfill their promise, and the farmers were disappointed, and that's why the reform measures ended at nothing. There are some implications that we can think of here. One is similar to what Dr. Kim said. It is similar when we talk about reforms. You can't just change around an institution and expect something will happen because that will not automatically lead to increased outputs. You have to change something with the physical inputs. It could be labor or fertilizer, plastics, oil, diesel in particular. These three commodities might not be sufficient in the DPRK economy. That's why they're agricultural output was so low. Or maybe the state was not able to make enough of purchases, and that's why there was not enough surplus to distribute to the farmers. If that's the case, what should South Korea do? For Chinese reforms and Vietnamese reforms, the early reforms have to achieve something. They have to be successful so they can move on to the next set of reforms. In the DPRK, they tried experimenting with some reforms, but they are not really making much progress. And so from the Republic of Korea, we have to try to do our best to try to foster more of these reforms in the DPRK. So perhaps we need to engage in more cooperation with the DPRK, provide more food aid and also more agricultural resources, and maybe a development assistance and economic cooperation projects. And this is where I would like to pivot to Dr. Bui and ask him some questions. I think you mentioned this before, but in 1986, the Doi Moi reforms took place. The state purchasing system, right, they purchase food, commodities, necessities. They would sell, or they would purchase them and then sell them to the farming households. But that was all abolished in the 1980s. Oh, that was done in 1989, so it took about 3 years for the Doi Moi reforms to be announced and then for the purchasing system to be abolished. The state purchasing system is not 100% just economic in nature. They're also political in nature because as a socialist economy, the state wants to maintain its leadership, its governance, and the purchasing system is a way to prop up the regime, that the state offers all of these supplies and necessities at an affordable price, and this is what leads to the propping up of the regime. So right now in the DPRK, although the distribution system is not really working, they try to maintain the facade of a distribution system in the DPRK. So I want to know, what was the situation like in Vietnam? When you abolished the purchasing system in Vietnam, was there a lot of controversy? Was there a lot of discussion on how to abolish the state purchasing system? So maybe there are some people who were opposed to it. Even if it was 1989, many people might have said that Vietnam is not sufficiently economically and politically sophisticated, so we have to keep the purchasing system. Or maybe some people said that we have to abolish the purchasing system because we are already at that level. So I want to know what kind of discussions were held around the abolition of the state purchasing system in 1989. Can you let us know?
예, 양봉수 교수님, 아주 북한
Mr. Dr. Yang talked about the fact that the DPRK reforms are not leading to much progress and much outcome. And you've pointed to two things in particular, that the state purchasing system and the process of the reforms. They were not enough to allow the farmers to feel some change because the state was not able to keep the promise. A lot of these pricing mechanisms and purchasing and selling, they are really based on promises between people. But the DPRK state, the regime, was not able to keep their end of the bargain. And this means that the productivity decrease is because there is a lack of good cohesion between inputs and outputs. That's why we have to think about what are the inputs that are going into the market in DPRK. And perhaps institutionally we can think about development assistance in DPRK. And he talked about what were the different developments that took place in Vietnam in the 1980s before they decided to dismantle the purchasing system.
Dr. Choi Jung-ho. Hello, I'm Choi Jung-ho from the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. Thank you for the kind introduction and invitation. I was able to learn a lot from our two speakers, Dr. Choi and Dr. Twan. I'd like to speak about three things over here with Kim Jong-un in place. I'd like to talk about economic measures in the agriculture sector that have been taken so far. what are they like? And the second thing is, if North Korea decides to pursue a reform, would it have to go in the direction that Vietnam has taken? Third point is, I will go back to that later. I'll come back to that later on. In 2012, December, Kim Jong-un came into power, and the economic policy direction was changed. Well, in relation to the agriculture reform, page 3 of Dr. Choi's presentation, where the point is moving from B to A. So rather than having this institutional change, it was trying to minimize input and maximize output. That was a type of reform that was driven by the government, only that. And as a result, the DPRK agricultural sector was able to grow substantially, but the problem is, compared to the average production growth of other neighboring countries, the agriculture sector in North Korea was not growing very fast. So it's the pace issue. You had the WFP food production volume that was presented, and I think there was a difference here because WFP, they said 5.5 million tons would have to be produced to meet the demand for North Korean people. And according to North Korean defectors or people that are taking close interest in the development of North Korea, they would say that 4 million to 4.5 million tons of production would be needed to meet the demands. Then it would be enough to feed the population there. So Kim Jong-un's reform policy, for example, like Vietnam's policy for improving the efficiency and effectiveness of the economy, the reform was not taken in that direction. It just wanted to meet the demand and supply of the North Korean population as a pivot for its reform policy. Second, you talked about the pathway for the agricultural development. Dr. Choi presented various tables here. Now, North Korea, I believe, probably believes that it's already undertaking that pathway. There could be relative differences because they don't have a relative pricing system, whether it is input fertilizers. Well, the system itself, North Korea would believe that it is excellent. However, there's a lack of resources. So inputs and these fertilizers, they're really not much of an issue because as long as they're able to have these inputs, and if they can start this virtuous cycle, they would be able to have a very productive production system. I think that's the reality that's confronting the North Korean economy. But the economic growth rate in North Korea is very much lagging behind, which could lead to insecurity on the part of the regime. And North Korea needs to understand that clearly. And as Dr. Kim said, foreign capital would have to go into the country for improving the infrastructure and raising the productivity. And reform would have to be going in that direction, Second point that I want to address is that reform paths would be different for North Korea versus Vietnam. Because the agriculture, for example, varies environment for the Vietnam in terms of, for example, rainfall, agriculture environment, the situation was quite positive. So even compared to world average, the production volume was rather high. But this is different for different DPRK because it is at a very disadvantageous state even compared to Vietnam. So in terms of Doi Moi, Vietnam reformed its agriculture, and self-sufficiency was a critical issue for the economy, whether they want to maintain the level or not. But during the Uruguay round in 1993, there was a reform of the agriculture sector, and there was an issue of self-sufficiency rate for agriculture for North Korea. But this was different from Vietnam because it was we had a very enabling, productive agriculture environment. And they would be able to, for example, get good input at a relatively competitive price in the international community. But this is different for North Korea. When it goes with the agricultural reform, for example, it would have to nurture commercial farms and would also have to maintain a healthy level of self-sufficiency in implementing the reforms. If you don't really have a lot of commercial farms, and the basis for agriculture production would be undermined, and agriculture sector would not be able to sustain itself. This is what sets North Korea apart from Vietnam. So nurturing commercial farms and self-sufficiency of food, these are conflicting concepts in a way, because our rice production conditions, for example, are not really competitive. So rice and wheat would have to be imported. But if you do so, then it will hurt the production base, and country will not be able to nurture commercial farms, and the agriculture will not remain sustainable. That's the situation of Korea, but that's not so for North Korea at all. So it's really not there yet. So in terms of restructuring and realignment, for example, if a certain plot of land is given to farmers, it has to be more than just self-sufficient farms. It would have to be scalable so that it can become commercial farms. But because North Korea has a cooperative system, scalability will not be an issue. But if privatization is actively pursued, like Vietnam, arable lands would have to become very scalable. And to nurture commercial farms and to induce overseas capital, how much foreign investment and joint venture would you allow? Well, Vietnam had a lot of production volume. So other than the agriculture special zones, foreign investment was not allowed in a specific agriculture sector. But North Korea, especially for South Korea, how much would North Korea allow that foreign investment to be made? That would be a very important issue to consider. And third, Dr. Choi gave us his views on the current status of North Korea. According to the World Bank's indicators, there's no consideration on globalization whatsoever, especially agriculture, finance, and privatization of a forward and backward industry. This is where foreign investors can come in, and South Koreans do have that investment actively going on in South Korea. But according to the World Bank indicator, that consideration is not in the equation at all. And in terms of the system alignment, you gave 5.6. You said that the central banking system was realigned and there are commercial banks in operation. But we're not exactly sure whether these commercial banks are really working well. So you would need to lower the grade for that indicator. For the privatization of forward and backward industry, so these specific elements over here, I think, are allowed by the state. So you would have to lower the scores that you gave for this specific indicator. So we cannot really say that North Korea is really reforming its agriculture. It is just focused on increasing its production volume. Thank you very much. Team Manager Choi Jang-ho, even compared to agriculture researchers, I think has a lot of understanding about the structural elements of agriculture policies. So you looked at the systematic aspects of agriculture, but also looked at production conditions and key crop environment and limitations that you see. When we had a market opening negotiation for agriculture produce, we had a lot of social conflicts because of lack of consensus on this. So what North Korea is experiencing and what Vietnam has experienced could be very different. Its main staple is rice, but it has a lot of rice to even export it out of the country. And it was able to develop commercial farms and go through market economy. So it had a good natural environment for producing crops, which would be a key differentiating factor from that of North Korea. As we have just experienced in South Korea, agriculture machineries, for example, processing, post-production, so forward and backward industries, all of these industries would have to review, and also financing system for agriculture needs to be reviewed and assessed at the same time. Thank you.
마지막 토론자로
Our last discussant is Lim Hyung-jun. Hello. I work at the Korea office of UN WFP. I listened to Dr. Choi's presentation. The food situation in the DPRK, the reasons, the causes, and also listen to Vietnam situation as presented by Dr. Tuan Bui, what kind of implications there are for the DPRKs looking at the Vietnamese experience. The WFP is actually doing work within the DPRK, so I try to bring some slides with me to tell you a little bit about the activities that we are undertaking in North Korea. Can I have a clicker?
이 자료가 아닌데 다른 자료로 제가
So that's actually not the slide that I asked to be shown. I think it's just a 2020 Korea Global Forum for Peace presentation material.
그 슬라이드 준비하는 동안 그냥 말로 얘기를 좀 이겁니다. 예, 그다음
Yes, that is the one. And because of COVID-19, right now in DPRK, they are having a very difficult situation both home and abroad. Their international borders are all closed. There is very limited movement, limited travel. There is a lack of goods exchange, for example. DPRK says that there are no confirmed COVID-19 cases in the country, but the impact is expected due to the global pandemic. And I think that Dr. Choi already said, but in the agricultural sector for seeds, fertilizer, various other resources and goods, because there's lack of access to these goods, and that will impact the DPRK agriculture sector as well. Because of different climate change-related disasters, the West Sea area and the southern area of North Korea have seen heavy rainfall, about very low rainfall, about 40 to 60% of the average rainfall. Whereas in certain other parts of the country, there were heavy rains. This is something that we were able to take in March. So we based this map on satellite imaging, and we've updated the map since then. If we take a look at the natural disasters in 2018 and 19, there was very low snow coverage. So there was a lack of soil moisture in the DPRK. And this year in July and August, as you know, there were heavy rains, storms in the DPRK. And this also affected the breadbasket of the DPRK. DPRK said that they're not going to accept international aid, that they're going to try to resolve this issue on their own. From the point of view of humanitarian aid, there are profound impacts on both food production and access to food. In 2018, together with the UN FAO, we did a nationwide survey, and we were able to see that the harvest yield of North Korean agriculture was the worst in a decade. And in 2019, the government reported a record high harvest of over 6.6 million, but this was not yet assessed by WFP. The agriculture agency in Korea said that the estimate is about 4 million instead. We have programs for young mothers, nursing moms, children. So we provide nutritional diets to them, and we also provide treatment assistance, especially for climate disaster-struck areas. We also, the primary part of our assistance comes in the form of nutritional assistance. WFP is active in 60 counties across 9 provinces in North Korea, shaded in blue, as you can see. We also helped the South Korea from 1964 to 1984, we provided 새마을 운동 projects, for example, various land infrastructure projects. Just one generation ago, we provided flood control projects here at the Republic of Korea. This was in 1984 or so, but in 1984, Republic of Korea graduated from receiving aid from the WFP, and now we are providing similar level of assistance in the DPRK, especially in those areas where the lack of access to food is really severe. We try to improve the related infrastructure and the facilities, and also to try to allow for more exports. This is the situation for 2002 to 2011. We planted about 13,000 hectares with plant trees. It's about 173 million seedlings, for example, and we also provided irrigation support. These are some of the pictures that you can see where we construct these embankments, irrigation systems, micro basins, new soil. These are some of the pictures that we took in North Korea. We were engaged in many of these activities in the past. In 2008, or since 2008, in 2008, we saw a decrease in the projects, but in 2019, we picked it up. There were 5 areas where they were struck by a Typhoon Ling, so we launched 5 additional projects there. Distribution of biscuits and providing farming equipment, for example. In 2019, 260,000 people were provided with assistance by the WFP, and also about 95,000 so far, especially when it comes to irrigation projects. So these are some of the other additional photographs where people are planting trees, forestry, or reforestation, and distributing food. In 2015, the North Korean regime came up with an action plan, a 10-year action plan on national agricultural action, and so on a complex forestry and agriculture action plan. We wanted to help this project to allow for food security, a sustainable land management system. Try to bring in these different systems that are already being used around the world. In 2015, we were able to engage in these 5 different projects that you can see in 5 provinces or 5 counties, and we planted 7 million seedlings in a hectare space worth about 1,372 hectares. We were able to build some waterways for these trees. And the action plan or the implementation plan that we put in at the time, we wanted to try to increase productivity in the areas of land where it's very slanted, when there is a slope. And we also allow for a sustainable enhancement of the farming system for North Korea. These are some of the partners that we worked with. MOLAP. We worked together with the Foreign Affairs Ministry in DPRK. The Switzerland SDC, ICRF. In Korea, we work together with CCC, which is led by Ko Gun, former Prime Minister. Right now, for many reasons, we place most focus on nutritional assistance, and we were not able to engage in specific projects for forestry and agriculture convergence, but we were able to focus on those areas where there's a lack of food, vulnerable to natural disasters. And we also want to make sure that 70% of our project recipients, the beneficiaries, are women. This is one of our local monitoring agents taking a picture with one of the North Korean residents. This is the kind of activity that we're going to continue in the DPRK. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Mr. Lim is with the UN World Food Program. And the World Food Program, up until recently, has been engaged in very specific projects across DPRK, as well as many different programs. And the DPRK has suffered flooding, drought, food scarcity, various natural disasters, and this has led to many difficulties in procurement of food. These actual cases on complex forestry and agricultural projects, this is an area where inter-Korean cooperation can be necessary, and also the cooperation with international actors.
있었고
So we've just heard from our 4 designated panelists for their comments. And we also are joined by online participants through streaming. And I think to Dr. Kwang Tuan, some additional questions have actually come forward. Dr. Kwang Tuan, can you hear us? Can you hear us, please?
추가적인 질문 두 가지 말씀.
I do have 2 questions for you. I'll give you a chance to respond to them. The first question from Gyeongnam, Northeast Asia College, Uya-kyung asked that Vietnam has. So why did Vietnam decide to forgo the cooperative system, and why is it a different case in DPRK? So why did Vietnam decide to forgo the joint farm system, joint cooperative system? And I think this was already addressed by Dr. Quang Tuan towards the end of the presentation, because you talked about the system transition in DPRK. Maybe you can add to that. And during the Hanoi summit, North Korea visited Vietnam. Is there any way for the 2 Koreas in Vietnam to be able to work together in partnership? Kim Gan-ho from the Agriculture and Fisheries Research Institute. So trilateral cooperation, is it possible? What are some of the alternatives that can be pursued? Within that trilateral framework, we have 13 minutes left for this session. I'm not sure whether we can use up 5 more minutes. I would like to ask the organizer here. Dr. Choi needs to address some questions, but as a moderator. Well, we got questions from our panelists. I think Dr. Choi can just address those questions offline. But for the purpose of this discussion, because we're trying to focus on the pathways for agricultural development, so Dr. Choi, I'll give you 3 minutes for you to address any concerns or comments that were raised. And since Bui Quang Tuan is joining us from very far, and because there are some additional questions for him, I'm going to give him 8 minutes. So please utilize this time to respond to comments raised by the discussants. Dr. Choi, could you make your comment briefly, just for 3 minutes? You could also take them offline as well.
예,
Is it okay if I go first?
그
Tôi xin trả
본부의
lời rất
소장님
ngắn
먼저
gọn.
하시죠.
Vì,
예, 예.
có khá nhiều câu hỏi cho tôi. Vâng, câu hỏi thứ nhất.
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to go first. I think Yu Ha-kyung asked about why did Vietnam give up these collectives and whether they led to actual results. So I just want to briefly touch upon that. In the case of these collectives, I think many of you might be familiar, but these collectives are not very effective. These are where many people work together for a common goal. Therefore, this means that individual person's commitment. Even if one person does a lot more work, or if one person is more effective or more productive, the incentives are shared by many different people. And so your incentive is to not work hard enough. You don't have to work hard because the other people are going to do the work for you. And so in many of these cases, the collectives were not able to reach a level of good production output. The collectives would say that this is going to be our accomplishments, but in many cases, they're only able to achieve about 50% of their goal. And there's no way to identify who was the person responsible for not fulfilling that performance. No, this means that we had no choice but to give up the collective system. And even now, I think that most Vietnamese people would agree with me that the collectives were really not helpful. And dismantlement of the collectives is very important to continue to develop the economy. However, the collectives still exist today in the DPRK. So I do think that there needs to be a restructuring of the collectives if the DPRK wants to try to enhance the level of productivity of the DPRK farmers. Yes, the second question was about the Hanoi summit, and somebody, I think the speaker or one of the questioners asked about if there is any way for trilateral cooperation. I think at the Hanoi summit there was some mention and proposals about sea development, other international cooperation, but I don't think there was any outcome that came about after the summit. And earlier, the slide that I just showed you, there was a slide on FDI, specifically foreign investment, after the 1980s. The DPRK has issued agricultural reforms for a very long time, but there was lack of a performance because if you take a look at the slide, in 1986 and 1999, if you could compare these two graphs against each other, you would see that between the years of 1986 and 1999, you would see some changes. In 1986, the Doi Moi reforms were initiated, and then right after that, we enacted the FDI law because we didn't have enough capital, we didn't have enough technology, we did not have enough experience to bring about more labor productivity. So after 1986, we tried to attract more FDI from abroad, and at the time, we were really focused on political stability above all. I think someone mentioned earlier, why was there a 3-year gap? Although the reforms were initiated in 1986, it took about 3 years until 1989. That's because we were really focusing on political stability at the time. Both within and without, we needed to have some level of solidarity. But we realized that it's difficult to do so on our own. So that's why we had to do our best to try to attract investment from overseas, to try to do those things that we could not do on our own. Although we'd have the commitment, we needed foreign capital, and we knew that bringing in the foreign capital would allow us to do much better in terms of the projects. And this was the opinion by various economic experts, and that's why we decided to work very hard to attract FDI around that time. So again, at the time, the global trend was many corporations, especially multinational corporations, were moving their production headquarters to Southeast Asia. So I think that around that time, the global trends were very conducive to Vietnam. And if we can take a look back at that slide from 1991 to 2002, the FDI really explodes. But that green line that you can see on the slide, there were FDI in joint venture, and there was 100% FDI stake, 100% stake investment. Recently, we've been trying to attract more projects with a 100% stake participation of foreign capital. And we did not restrict any of FDI in the agricultural sector either. The agricultural market was completely open to foreign investors. We knew that the investment would lead to much incentives early on. After the initiation of the Doi Moi reforms, foreign investors typically invested in the industrial sector. There was not a lot of interest that foreign investors had for the agricultural sector because for trade and industry, for heavy manufacturing, light industry, there were a lot of foreign investors in those areas, but a relative lack of investors in the agriculture sector. So, for those foreign investors willing to invest in the agricultural sector, we continue to offer preferable treatments, a lot of these preferable policies. And this took place around after 2000s, but in fact, they were already in place since 1996 that foreign investors could invest in the agricultural market in Vietnam. And we provide that platform because at the time, 75% of our population were farmers. So without any agricultural growth or development, we realized that there could be no national government, national development. And so for economic development and economic reforms, we continue to place heavy emphasis on the agricultural sector. I think one of the panelists mentioned that, yes, in 1995, Vietnam and the United States established diplomatic relations. We opened our market and our economy to them. And after the establishment of diplomatic ties with the United States, we immediately implemented market price liberalization. And in 2007, we became a member to the WTO. This was a very important development as well. I think if there is a difference between us and North Korea, we wanted to try to have political stability within our country, but at the same time, we tried to become more globalized in terms of our economy. And we wanted to integrate with many countries around the world. I think the important thing is connections and relationships. A country cannot grow on its own. You need to go together with the rest of the international community and engage in relationships of trust with other countries, and that's how you can grow. That is to say, there might be differences on the different priorities that you give to the items on the agenda, but you really have to work towards globalization. And I think that this is something that the DPRK really has to understand. And these efforts toward globalization are very important. What DPRK needs is how they are going to accept the market economy. But this is not something that the DPRK can do on its own. It has to be mindful of the global economy. And it appears that Chairman Kim Jong-un is committed to reform. But what's important is how he's going to promote this commitment, because he should not just hold on to this commitment and keep it within North Korea, but he has to open it more to more people.
Năng suất và năng lực cạnh tranh. Thế nhưng mà công nghệ thì hiện nay
In Vietnam, we really placed a focus on the agricultural sector and really worked towards market reforms. And I do hope that for the DPRK, for them to engage in economic development, that they really have to place an emphasis on the agricultural sector. That's very important. That's why FDI would be very important. As I mentioned before, Vietnam really worked very hard to attract foreign investors, and we really worked very hard to bring in JVs. For North Korea, they are not engaged in any kind of activity, the likes of which that Vietnam had. DPRK has to exert some efforts to attract FDI. If Kim Jong-un were here, that I would tell him to do so. And secondly, agriculture is very important, but also industrial services are important as well. That they have to be done together. And agriculture is important, but we are seeing a lot of a transition to agricultural services as well. They should be changed. That will become an industry on its own. And later, this would be tied in with a trade liberalization. The DPRK is saying that we have to do agricultural reforms because they don't have a lot of food, but I really hope that this will all be done simultaneously. But to do so, there needs to be more credibility for the DPRK in the international community. And this means that the DPRK has to work towards the improvement of ties with other countries. That is to say, Vietnam has to, the DPRK has to open itself more to its friends, to other countries. Although I find it unfortunate that because of COVID-19, they were not able to do so. I think that there needs to be a flexible approach on the part of the DPRK. Yes, so again, FDI is very important, and also training the experts within DPRK. And if possible, if I've had the opportunity, I would like to learn more about the DPRK, do more research.
아주 성실하고
Thank you very much for that very passionate response. We are out of time. So, Dr. Choi, because you are here in Korea, I think that you can just maybe restrict your comments to 22 minutes, and then I will end.
예, 뭐 짧게만 말씀.
I'll just make it very brief. So, with Kim Jong-un in power, there has been an ambitious push for reform and liberalization. I don't think I need to really go into details of that because they were already addressed by previous speakers. Now, they've designated special zones for market opening and so forth. So investment is coming in from China, even for the agriculture sector. So attracting FDI to improve productivity has actually taken place, but due to the sanctions regime on North Korea, it all has come to nothing. And Dr. Kim asked whether there have been any practical benefits, and I think yes, but to a limited degree before Kim Jong-un came into power. If you look at food production volume, 4.5 million tons or so, but with the Kim Jong-un in power, it has improved. So even if we do this on an apple-to-apple comparison basis, we can say that the production volume has increased, and also for the processing industries as well. There has been a lot of development there. So yes, to a certain degree, reform has been effective, but in terms of liberalization, because it is completely isolated from the international community, such benefits cannot be really sustained, and they're very limited. And we would need to bring some practical changes to that landscape. I am very sorry for not allowing you with a lot of time to respond to that. We have a question back to Dr. Bui Kwang-tun. We have Kim Dong-il from the MAFRA. Looking at the current sanctions regime in North Korea, what would be the right way for pursuing inter-Korean cooperation? I know it's a very difficult question, so if you could just limit your response to 1 minute, please.
북한 제재 상황에서
What are some measures for inter-Korean agricultural cooperation in the midst of the sanctions regime? Do you have any ideas?
요거는 별도로 다음에 좀 생각을 하셔가지고 메일로.
Or maybe you can provide us with an email response. I think that in that regard, because we are out of time, we will have to end. I'm very sorry that I was not able to do good time management. We are 5 minutes behind schedule because of my very poor time management skills. So with that, we would have to close.
Một ít tôi xin trả lời luôn. Tôi xin trả lời.
So I will provide you with an email response.
좀 답변 부탁합니다.
tôi xin trả lời rất
시간이
nhanh
예.
thôi.
예, 그 오늘 그 두 분의 발제와 내
So we've had two presentations and a discussion by four panelists, and we got three questions from online participants as well. It's true that we're not fully knowledgeable about the current state of agriculture in North Korea, and I think there are a lot of differences in terms of perspectives as well. And as I was listening to this discussion, I thought about three things here. First of all, it is an ongoing process, the change in North Korea. And of course, there are things that North Korea would have to do, but there is a factor for promoting solidarity and cooperation with also South Korea as well as the international community that really requires a lot of thoughts. Social, economic, natural environment, as well as food, stability, and security, which is also related to the institutions and the system of North Korea. All of these different elements would have to take into consideration when we're looking at the agriculture sector. It is very important to have these multi-disciplinary panel here to address this topic, whether it is offline or online. I hope that panelists over here would be able to continue their conversation in the future. And Dr. Che and Dr. Bui Kwang-tun, you talked a lot about system change. You very much emphasized the importance of system change. It really requires a lot of efforts, especially endeavors on the part of the members of the community. Laos and Vietnam are the countries that I most frequently visit. I see, for example, how agriculture is managed, and I've learned a lot from giving lectures over there. After we had a agricultural land reform in Korea, we found a way to improve productivity through investment. For example, improving the agriculture production basis. And this productivity increase was possible because there was an agricultural land reform, and also the family farm system also went through a lot of changes because once you have that asset, it would provide the platform for cooperative and also financing for agriculture. But if you go to Vietnam and Laos, you really don't have a fully working financial system. It is because of the ownership of the property. The freedom is not given to people over there, and which is the case in DPRK, whether it is land reform, infrastructures, SOCs. They are actually intertwined. They're related to one another, so they would all have to go hand in hand. So as I go around these different countries in Asia giving lectures, it actually gives me an opportunity for me to relearn about the South Korean economy, because I listen to, for example, questions coming from people over there, and I use that as an opportunity to relearn the Korean situation. Now, from the discussion today, the reform of North Korea, I think, could serve as an opportunity for me to look at our problems in South Korea and how we can improve our system much better. So it's very important to try to learn the North Korean system from the perspective of North Koreans rather than just a South Korean. I think we could do a cooperative research between, for example, countries over here in the region, including China and Vietnam. And we could also have North Korea expert study, looking at land financing, distribution, infrastructure. We need to have a cross-disciplinary discussions, bringing people from different expertise, because they really don't have a lot of understanding and knowledge about North Korea. If we could bring these people on board to think about how to improve North Korea, it's very important to have a comprehensive view about the North Korean system. The reforms are currently underway, but if you compare that to international standard, it's still very much far lagging behind. But why so? And to understand the reasons behind, we need to have, again, cross-disciplinary research efforts. So Dr. Bui, I would like to ask for your continued support and interest in cooperative as well as comparative research with the South Korean researchers over here. And from Kiev and from many experts who are here today, and internally as well, those people that are representing various fields of expertise should really come together as one to conduct this joint research to understand a better way for promoting development of North Korea. Well, we really didn't have a lot of time for this discussion, but it was nonetheless a good opportunity for us to understand us much better as well as Vietnam and North Korea. And I would like to conclude the seminar. Thank you very much.